Warning: the following podcast is intended for mature audiences and does contain spoilers. If you are sensitive to anything in particular, I recommend looking up this film on doesthedogdie.com. It is a user-submitted database that is filled with all sorts of different trigger warnings and content warnings for people who may be sensitive to those things. Check it out and take care of yourself. Welcome back to We Creeps, the podcast where you can get all of your spooky without any of the scares. I am your host, Evan Exhumed, and every week I provide an in-depth summary, review, and trivia for the latest horror releases, classics, and some weird ones you probably never heard of. This week I will be covering the horror film The Angry Black Girl and Her Monster, which is directed by Bomani J. Story. It stars Leah Delon Hayes, Denzel Whitaker, Chad L. Coleman, and Riley Brooke Stith. I was really excited about this one and ended up really liking it. I feel like we've gotten a lot of really good black horror in the last decade or so, between Jordan Peele, the movie Ma, Lovecraft Country, Sorry to Bother You, The Blackening. I mean, a lot of really good stuff in just the last 5 to 10 years. I think horror in general has been sort of predominantly white, like most of film. And so it's really cool to see a lot of films coming out that represent different minorities and cultures and groups and things like that. Like we just had It Lives Inside, which was an Indian horror film. The Horror of Dolores Roach, which was really good. And honestly, too many to name. It's also not necessarily that these films never existed, it's just that they're now actually getting the credit that they deserve. Just a reminder, the timestamps for the summary, review, and trivia portions of the podcast are going to be in the description. With that said, let's go ahead and get started on the summary portion of The Angry Black Girl and Her Monster.
You do not quite get what I mean. Herr Frankenstein was interested only in human life. First to destroy it, then recreate it.
The film opens up with the narration of Vicaria, our main character, which I think is a little reference to the name Victor, but she details how she feels that death is simply a disease that needs to be cured. Her mother was killed with a stray bullet when she was 8 years old, just months before she was going to become a doctor. And her brother, Chris, was just recently killed in some gang shooting violence. I guess he was part of one of the local gangs. And so she's sick of it. She's tired of people that she loves dying for whatever reason. And she is going to figure out how to solve death. And we see her brother's corpse having been shot, and she herself drags it back to her house. We also learn that her father works 2 jobs, works really hard to provide for her brother and her, but, you know, obviously losing his wife and his only son, it's going to take a toll on him emotionally. During this beginning scene, it's a little bit of a montage kind of showing the daily life of the neighborhood that she lives in. There's a sort of contrast between a lot of kids running around playing, families doing whatnot, and then you also have this gang culture that exists. You know, they're tying red bandanas to things to show territory. They're just kind of hanging out, doing little deals and things like that. So this gives you kind of an idea of the community that she lives in. And she herself is known as the mad scientist among the children of this community. And she interacts with a few of them, and she's very good with these kids, and it's kind of sweet to see. We also see where her lab is, which looks to be like an abandoned warehouse of some sorts that she's got locked up. Some kid tries to get into it, but she kind of scares him off, saying she's got dead bodies in there. And she's not lying, but he doesn't really, obviously believe her. We then are taken to her school, which looks to be a private school just based on the uniforms and sort of the atmosphere of the school. And she is in her science class, her bio class, and she's talking to her teacher very excitedly about her theory about how death is a disease that can be cured. And her teacher is just kind of like a mean old white lady who's already throwing some microaggressions at her. But because Vicaria, I guess, interrupts her a couple times, she calls security on her and also says the wrong name. She calls her Vicky instead of Vicaria. And she's just like, oh, I'm just going to call you Vicky because that's much easier for me, which is like kind of insane because like Vicaria and Vicky are like not that different in names. So I was just like, Jesus Christ, lady, like fucking get it together. Like you have an education degree, like, and you can't pronounce a fucking simple name, like. Ugh. So Vicaria does a one up and says, well, if we're going to be picking each other's names, I'm going to call you Miss Bitch now. And so, of course, this very much upsets the teacher, and she gets forcefully removed by a grown ass man, this child. I mean, Vicaria is probably like 14, and she gets just like manhandled and thrown to the ground by this fucking security guard. This entire exchange is unfortunately common in a lot of US schools, and I think it is really poignant commentary on that. That is one reason I really like this movie, because it does combine that political commentary, that social commentary, as well as being a reimagining of Frankenstein, which we'll see more of. So there's a little parent teacher conference at the end of the day. Donald, her father, comes, and he's just the best dad. He basically tells the woman, look, she's a child. You are a grown woman. You should not be calling fucking the cops on my child. I'm never going to tell my daughter to not think outside of the box. You need to do your fucking job. Teach my child. Stop being a piece of shit. And honestly, so satisfying, because so many of these movies, just in general, I feel like anytime a child gets in trouble, the parents never believe them. And it was just really cool to see Vicaria's dad just back her up so strongly without any hesitation. And I just really loved that. From there, we get a nice little montage of Vicaria at her lab. She is working on her brother Chris, slicing and dicing. She's got some mad scientist notes that she's looking at. She's giggling as she's like taking apart parts of his body. So she's really enthusiastic about her work, and we love to see it. Shortly after, we meet one of her friends, Aisha. She is pregnant, and so she's going to come up later, but we can tell in this little scene that they're very close. Later that night, there are gunshots heard. She goes outside to see what's going on because the paramedics are already there. She sees a little boy, the one earlier who was asking her about her laboratory. He has been shot. This is gang related. And as she's watching him slowly die on the concrete with the paramedics, a gang member, I think his name is Kango. I'm not 100% sure if it was him, but he comes up later. He puts a little red bandana on that area to signify territory. This, of course, really upsets Vicaria, and she is upset with the amount of death in her life. And she is contemplating this, and then she thinks back to the little boy getting hit with a defibrillator, and it inspires her. She's like, oh shit, I need to electrify my fucking corpse to bring him to life. So she runs over to her lab to start messing with that. She uses some sort of magical electrical setup. I mean, she's like a genius, so I can't even begin to understand how she accomplished this, but she gets basically all the electricity in the area, and she powers it and cycles it into Chris's corpse, and it brings him back to life. And he is, of course, much like Frankenstein, he's hulking. He is kind of, grunting and things like that. And she says to him, holy shit, I did this. I'm going to go show you who is killing our family and ruining our dad's life. Let's go ahead and attack some of these gang members and drug dealers. So Vicaria goes to one of the cars that is having drugs put into it so people can come and pick them up and exchange money or whatever. And one of the gang members comes out and points a gun at both of them. He shoots Chris, but does nothing. And Chris just starts to strangle him, nearly killing him. I think it does imply that he kills him afterwards, but that's off screen. And Vicaria is quite startled by this, and she runs back to her lab. Chris chases her, and she's just like, oh, I don't know what to do. So she locks him inside, and he's a little upset about that, but she runs back home because other gang members are looking for her and Chris. So the next morning, the leader of the gang, Kango, gets his other members to wrangle her and basically threatens her, tells her, where the hell's my drugs? Who is with you? And she obviously can't explain that she recently, brought her brother back to life. So she is quiet about it, and he says to her he's going to force her to be his mad scientist and cut drugs and measure and do all sorts of things until I guess she gives up this other person or gives up the drugs. And so, yeah, she's a little upset about that. Her life is threatened by this gang leader, and she's just not really sure what to do at this point. I think it's also implied that her father is using drugs as well to sort of cope with a lot of his PTSD, his depression, I mean, losing your son and your wife in the span of like 5 years is a lot. So she heads back to the lab and sees that Chris has broken out, which is not good. The next day, we see that Vicaria is over at Aisha's, who we reveal that is actually her cousin. We also learn that Jada, Aisha's daughter, has a new friend named Chris that gets mentioned. So Vicaria obviously asks Jada, "Where the hell are you hearing my brother? What's going on?" And she points to a little hole in the wall. And that hole leads to another apartment that's been condemned or abandoned next door. So Vicaria goes to go check that out. As she's about to go into the apartment, Kengo's enforcer comes and pulls her back over to Kengo and tells her, I need you to make more drugs or do whatever I'm asking you to do with these drugs. And they have a bit of a conversation, and she's pretty pissed at him. And he claims that, his drugs are helping the community because there aren't enough mental clinics, and addiction is more of an emotional issue than a substance issue. And he mocks her for her father coming to him for drugs. And so, yeah, I mean, he's forcing her to be part of this drug situation. And she leaves at the end of the day and goes back to that apartment to try to find her brother. So she does find him in one of the rooms, and it looks like he's strangling, I think, the enforcer who's been bossing her around a little bit. And so she panics and runs away, runs back home. She starts kind of having like scary visions of him or something. Nothing magical, but just like, PTSD response kind of thing. And her dad comes in and comforts her a little bit. And Vicaria, I love you, but I'm just not really sure what you were expecting with this. Like, the first thing you said to him was like, let's go kill those fucking people who are killing our family and community. So it's kind of your fault. But I guess, I mean, she is supposed to be Victor von Frankenstein or whatever. So I guess that does make sense. Also, this whole time, Vicaria's glasses, one of the lenses is like cracked. So it's actually kind of cool. It makes her look a little bit more like a mad scientist. So Vicaria and Aisha, their families come together and have a little bit of dinner. There's a little bit of argument between Aisha and Vicaria. Vicaria thinks that she can sort of change the system herself by becoming a scientist and fixing things. And Aisha feels that the system is already broken, so there's no use in trying to fix it. She's a little bit more radical. And the dad's just like, well, maybe you're both right. And so they kind of laugh and go, no. And during this, Chris, the Frankenstein guy, he is peeking through the little crack in the wall and is listening to them watching their family dinner. And he is, kind of creeping there. It's also interesting, too, because Vicaria's little niece, Jada, refers to Chris as her like imaginary friend almost. And so the parents just aren't really thinking it's serious. So that's how she's kind of getting away with talking about him so much. As they're having dinner, a police officer tries to get into their house without a warrant. The dad is very quick and shuts the door and locks it and says that they're not allowed in there. And basically they're looking for Chris or somebody who matches Chris's description because there was a cop that was murdered, apparently. We then move to a scene where Chris is standing in the middle of like the street or something, and these cops pull up saying, oh, this looks like the guy that we're looking for. And Chris now can speak. He is speaking. They ask him what he's doing, and he said, I'm looking for my father. So the cop tries to arrest him. He breaks free through the handcuffs and just jumps on this dude and just fucking beats his face so hard that the cop is just completely disfigured, dead. Vicaria then goes to Kengo. I guess she found the drugs that her brother had taken or got mixed up in the whole, bringing him back to life exchange thing. And he is taking care of his very sick grandmother. So that adds a little bit of humanity to him. He's not just like, this gang member who has no feelings or morality, which I really liked. And Kengo says that she can leave, and then that's fine. But the enforcer shows up, and he's actually still alive from his fight with Chris. And he's like, no, she's not getting off easy. And Kengo's like, you need to back the fuck off. I said she could leave. You need to fuck off. And so the fucking enforcer dude machetes him in the goddamn shoulder, likely killing him. I don't know. We'll see. And so she runs off. And while this is happening, Chris has returned home and has an exchange with their father. And he begins to panic because at first he thinks it's his son, but then he realizes, it's this monster. And so Chris starts to strangle him. And while this is happening, Vicaria comes home and is like, what the hell's going on here? So she walks into her room and sees that her dad is presumably dead on the floor. And she sits against the wall and she begins to sob and grieve and weep. The bad guy enforcer shows up and is about to kill her. Kango apparently shows up and tries to stop him. And then Chris makes an appearance to protect his sister. The enforcer guy tries to machete Chris, but Chris grabs his hand and puts the machete back into his face. So Kango and Vicaria panic and go into the bedroom and block the door. They have a little bit of a conversation about who's worse, somebody who gives drugs to a community or someone who steals corpses and rebuilds their brother and brings them back to life. So that's a kind of a little bit of a funny conversation, but also a very serious one. And then Kango says, look, I shouldn't have sent your brother to attack those other gang members. I'm sorry. I'm going to block the door here. You go to your lab, do what you got to do. And Vicaria realizes that she should electrocute Chris again to kill him, that the electricity will stop his heart if it did start his heart in the first place. So while she's at the lab, she runs into her little niece Jada, who has blood on her for some reason, but she explains that she was the one who taught Chris who his family was. She taught him how to speak and read, and that's part of why she was reading like this alphabet book or something out loud while he was there in the walls. And she tells her to go hide or whatever and get out of there. And she's still looking for this one part that she needs to make the whole situation happen with the electricity. Apparently it was left at the apartment, so Kango shows up just completely fucked up. He drops the part on the floor and then proceeds to die. So she picks up the part, thanks him or his dead body, and then she runs to the generator where she's going to set that up to electrocute Chris. Chris then begins to chase her. She runs back to the lab, and then she sets up the like Frankenstein platform thingy right in front of the door. So that way when he comes in, he has to touch it and move it. As he comes in, he touches it. She activates that electricity, and that shit just goes crazy. She does successfully kill him. The last thing he says is, I'm a monster. However, Vicaria looks at him and says, no, you're not a monster. And her little niece asks, why did he do this? Like, why did he start attacking people? And Vicaria's reasoning is that everyone treated him like a monster and was afraid of him, so he became a monster. I do feel like this segment right here and the conversation she's having with her little niece is social commentary, but I am not qualified to speak on it. However, I do think it is pretty poignant, although a little heavy-handed. I mean, Vicaria did kind of forget that she's the one who told him to go murder a bunch of people in the first place. Like the very first thing that he ever did was because of her. So that I had a little bit of a problem with, but overall, I think the message is good. Her niece Jada says, hey, while you're here, can you also bring back our other family members? And Vicaria is like, what do you mean other family members? And she's like, oh, all the people that he killed. So it's revealed that he killed Aisha as well as her father and her aunt as well. Vicaria tells Jada, I'm sorry, this is not going to work. They're all dead. And Jada gets really sad. But then Vicaria realizes that these are fresh bodies rather than old bodies. And she's like, you know what, Jada, let's fucking give it a whirl. So they put Aisha on the table, electrocute the shit out of her, and she wakes up totally normal. She knows her name. She's not a monster. She's not freaking out or anything. And yeah, she's just alive. Not only that, I don't know if I mentioned earlier, Aisha was pregnant. The baby inside of her is also alive too. So she got a 2-for-1 deal with that resurrection. So Aisha looks at Vicaria and is like, where the hell is the rest of our family? And Vicaria looks at her and goes, they'll be here soon, with like tears in her eyes. Fade to black. The movie ends. Now, with the summary portion out of the way, let's go ahead and get started on the review portion.
It's alive. Oh, it's alive. It's alive. It's alive.
I really did like this one. It got sort of middling reviews from everyone else. I mean, it is a Shudder exclusive, so I wasn't anticipating it getting a lot of critical or audience reviews really in general, but I think it's a solid film. I think, I said earlier in the summary that some of the messages are a little heavy-handed, not super subtle, but overall that's doesn't necessarily a bad thing. I think that it's a solid movie. I think that it had a lot to say. I think each character sort of represented a different aspect of this community. You had Vicaria, who is someone who's trying to work within the system somewhat to rebuild it and make it better. Her entire interest in going into academia and becoming a scientist. You have Kango, who believes that he is helping the community despite being part of this gang, selling drugs and whatnot. You know, to him, we see his grandmother in that one scene. So we see that aspect of him sort of embracing what he's been given and the life that he has and trying to work within that system. That's really just the tip of the iceberg here, and I'm not going to get too deep into it. But again, this film was really good, and I definitely recommend checking it out if you can stomach a little bit of gore. It's a good movie. It's a solid movie, and We Creeps is going to give it a 3.5 out of 5. With the review portion out of the way, let's get on to the next portion, which is Trick or Trivia.
We must find another brain.
Trivia number 1. The cover of Vicaria's scientific notebook says The Modern Prometheus by Vicaria F. The Modern Prometheus is a subtitle of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Trivia number 2. The monster relearns human speech by observing the family through a hole in the wall, which is the same as the original novel. Trivia number 3. During the parent-teacher meeting earlier in the movie, Vicaria's teacher comments on their lovely European-sounding name, and Vicaria's dad says that it probably was branded on my ancestors' flesh by an overzealous German overseer. It starts with F, so conceivably Frankenstein. It's never fully stated, but it is sort of a subtle reference, I think. Not too much trivia on this one, so that's all I've got for you, but tune in next week for more horror movie trivia. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of We Creeps. If you want more content, you can go ahead and follow me on TikTok, Instagram, which I'm the most active on. I post little funny horror memes and videos, which a lot of people seem to be really liking. So if you're from TikTok or Instagram, hello, and thank you for joining the podcast, and I hope you're enjoying it. If you want to support the show directly, you can check out my Patreon. You can buy some merch at tpublic.com, or you can just send a message saying that you love the show. That warms my heart, that keeps me going, and it keeps me motivated to keep making more content for you guys. So with that said, I hope you have a really great start to your December, and I know everyone's probably going to be busy over the next few weeks with the holidays and whatnot, but don't forget to stay spooky out there.